Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next recording as part of our workshop series for the Climate Resilience Roadmap for Ontario Municipal Infrastructure Systems. This roadmap was developed by the Regional Public Works Commissioners of Ontario, or RPWCO. My name is Shelley Hazen, and I'm a climate change specialist with Savanta GEI, and today I'm joined by Glenn Milner from the Climate Risk Institute. We're also joined by RPWCO Climate Change Subcommittee members from the City of Thunder Bay, Windsor, Ottawa, and the region of Durham. And we'd also like to thank Rebel Consulting for their contributions to the development of this roadmap. So this is our fourth training session, and today we'll walk you through the risk assessment and prioritization process. So if you haven't already done so and would like to obtain an overview of the entire process of the RPWCO roadmap, we recommend that you go back and listen to training session 1. And that provided an introduction to the roadmap and summarized each step of the process along the way. Training session 2 covered steps 1 and 2 of the roadmap, and that was all about engagement and setup and taking stock of your municipal asset inventory. Training session 3 then provided guidance on the climate scenario analysis. So today's session lines with step 4 of the roadmap, as you'll see highlighted on this slide, and it's all about assessing and prioritizing. So to begin, let's go through what you'll learn or what you can expect to get out of this step in the roadmap. So there are some key steps and best practices that are noteworthy here. So based on the results from step 2 of the roadmap, you'll begin to assemble a GIS library of all critical infrastructure. And that's infrastructure such as hospitals, utilities, emergency response buildings, as well as information on institutions and industrial areas, and even private homes. You'll also assemble information on primary roads, rails, bus routes, and other public transportation routes. And next, you'll pair all assets with a damage function in relation to a specific hazard. So damage function is a term that comes up throughout the guide, and it translates to how intense or severe a hazard is and how that affects an asset based on a damage ratio. Now, this ratio is based on the repair cost of an asset to its replacement value, so a cost to rebuild an entire asset. And damage functions for flooding are typically more readily available than other hazards. So for other hazards than flooding, consequences can actually be evaluated in what's called a multi-criteria analysis. And that's a linear scale, usually from 0, which is no consequence, to 20, which is extreme economic consequence. So critical infrastructure should rank the highest. Now, next you'll learn how to assess the risk today for at least two other future points. So that's likely the 2050s and the 2080s, and that brings you out to the end of the century. And this will be depending on the outcome of step 3 that you've just gone through. And for each point in time, you're going to evaluate damages from at least 3 different return periods and interpolate results to obtain risk. So after assessing the risk, it's time to actually validate GIS data, consequences, and results with your local stakeholders and collaborators. And this is in order to ensure that the theoretical results are actually matching historic events. Next, you're going to learn how to identify the top 10 areas most at risk in the multi-criteria analysis across all hazards, and you'll start identifying adaptation or mitigation projects. And if more solutions are considered for the same area, you can use what's known as a cost-benefit analysis to help you prioritize between projects. So we're going to be unpacking all these points in the next few slides and in our training session today. So a risk assessment is an essential process in building business cases for informed decision-making within climate change adaptation. And a risk assessment provides the necessary input to help you prioritize between different planning scenarios, plans or designs, and to identify economic optimal levels of service or protection for your municipality. So you'll build a business case for climate adaptation in relation to baselines, and this shows action as compared to a do-nothing scenario. So a risk assessment is going to help you prioritize between adaptation options, plans, or designs for a specific area or asset. And you'll define optimum level of service for climate adaptation. And lastly, prioritize a course of action. So you've been hearing this term a lot in our training videos, and you'll see it time and time again throughout the roadmap, and that's risk. And risk is defined as the likelihood of future climate hazards and the potential impacts of these hazards on societies. So climate risk may be expressed in expected annual damages as dollars per year, or in simpler cases as a risk level that's just ranked from, say, a low to a high risk. So it's defined by the annual probability of a hazard that's actually multiplied by the consequences of that hazard. So the consequences of a hazard can be further broken down to the exposure, the vulnerability, and the adaptive capacity of the affected people or systems that you're looking at. So something to note is that a risk assessment typically only considers one type of hazard. So the consequences, for example, from wildfire might be different to the consequences of a flood, for example. And likewise, the adaptation measures to consider in order to minimize consequences, they're also going to be very different. So your risk should be evaluated separately for each hazard that you're looking at. And all of these concepts that you see outlined on this slide are further defined and explored throughout the roadmap, just in case you need a reminder as you're going through. Now, a risk assessment can be divided into 5 broad steps, and this ranges from the background research and data gathering, consequence assessments, refinement and validation, risk estimation, and prioritizing strategies and pulling all of this information together to assist you in designing a climate change adaptation strategy at a later date. And we just want to note that the roadmap does not provide specific guidance on designing a climate change strategy, but it does set you up with all of the necessary information that you'll need to be able to actually complete this at a later date. So each of these steps is going to be described in further detail in the coming slides. So the first step of a risk assessment is background research and data gathering. So spatial overlay of data sets and analysis at multiple levels is really key to help you prioritize areas of high risk and to identify potential synergies and cumulative effects. So this is why GIS data are essential for a risk assessment. And you may recall that we said this in step 2 of the roadmap. So a hazard must be defined spatially and by an occurrence probability. And again, we discussed this in step 2. It's essential to consider assets that are affected and gather the GIS data on these assets. So building footprints or point locations are needed at a minimum at this stage. So for a more advanced risk assessment, other data could include things like critical infrastructure, federal, provincial, and municipal institutions, and even transportation infrastructure, just to name a few. Now, once data have been gathered, it must be evaluated. So depending on the quality of hazard data, various information such as inundation depths and detention times, maybe temperature extremes or length of heat waves that may be available, and it's going to influence the consequences when a specific hazard occurs. So first, the spatial hazard must be evaluated. And as previously stated, the hazard data, it may be correlated to a probability, or in a simpler case, maybe just a scale from a very low likelihood of occurrence to a high likelihood of occurrence. And literature studies into asset vulnerability are also essential at that stage in order to know how assets are or may be affected by hazards. So it's important to note that assets are not affected in the same manner for all hazards. And as with hazard data, asset vulnerabilities may also be scaled in a simpler analysis instead of just evaluated in monetary terms. So this can be done through what's called a multi-criteria analysis, an MCA, where assets are ranked on a numeric scale depending on their economic and socioeconomic impact. And I'm going to provide more on MCAs in the next slide. So an MCA, a multi-criteria analysis, evaluates multiple criteria, as the name indicates. And this actually helps groups to talk about their decision opportunity or the problem that needs to be solved in a way that allows them to consider the values that each views as important. So an MCA is a decision-making analysis that actually evaluates multiple and even potentially conflicting criteria as part of the decision-making process. So when you're estimating asset vulnerability, think about the impacts that it would have if an asset was struck or impacted by a specific hazard. So some questions you can ask may be, how many people will be affected? What would it cost to repair that asset if it was affected by a hazard? How long would it take for the asset to be functioning again? Is it a critical asset to the community? Does it provoke cascading effects? And these are just some of the considerations that can help influence your ranking. So after the initial desktop studies into hazard data and asset vulnerabilities, your data must be validated at this stage. So a workshop with local stakeholders and collaborators is really encouraged at this point. So combining your desktop studies with local knowledge is one of the best methods of not only validating your preliminary studies, but also getting stakeholders and the community involved and installing a sense of a co-creation and shared responsibility for this work. So in step one, if you recall, you were asked to categorize stakeholders and identify optimal methods of timing for engagement. So you can leverage those efforts now in identifying key participants to invite as part of this refinement and validation process. Now, when hazard data and assets have been evaluated separately, the next step is to overlay data sets of probabilities and consequences. So depending on the level of analysis and quality of data, there may be several approaches that you can use here. And in general, the consequences of a hazard should be multiplied with the probability of a hazard. So in a more advanced risk assessment, the risk is actually expressed in expected annual damage of costs of a cell or an asset in this case, and that may be correlated to a depth damage function of a specific asset type. And you can refer to further reading and resources in the roadmap to really define and dig deeper into these concepts that we're just providing a high-level summary on today. So risk assessments can be conducted for both current scenarios and future scenarios. And due to climate change and more extreme weather, climate risk will increase in the future under a do-nothing scenario. So a 100-year flood event today may be something like a 50-year flood event in the 2080s. And that's just a hypothetical example, but it's just something to keep in mind as you're going through this estimating risk in this planning process. And the detailed pathway requires modeling, so more data and more processing time, but it also minimizes the uncertainties and can actually yield a better basis for your planning. Now, designing an overall climate change adaptation strategy includes identifying current and future hazards, prioritizing these areas, identifying level of service, and an overall methodology for financing these strategies. So while this methodology may set up some guidelines for adaptation projects, a strategy typically does not involve detailed planning and designs of specific projects. So these follow once an adaptation strategy for the whole municipality has been agreed upon. And it's important to recognize here that there's no one-size-fits-all formula for designing adaptation strategies. And that's because municipalities vary greatly in their size and their resources, land use, and population densities, for example. And although the roadmap, as I said before, does not provide detailed guidance on designing adaptation strategies, it does provide you with the results that can help in prioritizing which hazards should actually be a focus in your adaptation efforts. So for instance, stakeholders may agree that some assets are too essential for the functioning of society to actually allow any sort of damage or losses. And therefore, specific adaptation projects may need to be prioritized above all others. So the roadmap then provides you with this critical information to help you with the adaptation strategy down the line. Now, this slide highlights an activity in the guidebook, activity number 13, that actually helps the user prioritize hazards based on estimated risk analysis outputs. So the outcome of completing this activity can be used to target specific adaptation actions or projects, or even municipal mechanisms that are related to highest priorities over time. So it can be used to make the case and actually inspire further funding support by municipal council and senior decision makers. And based on your risk assessment or assessment, you can plot your expected risk over time for all available hazards based on your current situation. And next, you would identify which hazards have the highest risk. And then you can actually rank your hazards from the highest to the lowest risk over, say, the next 30 years or whatever timeframes that you're looking across. So I'm going to walk you through a relevant case study that's detailed on page 48 of the roadmap. And you'll recall from the previous training session that case studies are scattered and peppered throughout the entire roadmap to provide additional guidance and inspiration in reading. So we highly suggest that you dig a little bit deeper into the case studies that are listed throughout the roadmap. So the Toronto Region Conservation Authority completed a detailed flood risk assessment to rank flood vulnerable clusters across their watersheds. And they did this by capturing structure level and neighborhood level attributes and risk exposure. And then they estimated the cost of flood damage that was inflicted by a range of potential flood magnitudes. So they looked at the 2, the 5, the 10, the 25, the 50, 100, and regional storms that were actually used to model riverine flood hazard. So in total, 41 flood vulnerable clusters, which were previously identified across the TRCA watersheds, were ranked in this assessment or this case study. And total direct flood damages were estimated for residential, for commercial, industrial, institutional, as well as business interruption and residential displacement. So across all flood vulnerable areas, $47.9 million average of annual damages were estimated, along with more than 43,000 residents and 40,000 employees being impacted across the jurisdiction in the event of a regulatory storm event. So a risk ranking exercise included scoring tangible building associated impacts, community impacts, social vulnerability, infrastructure, and that included roads, transit, as well as other preparedness factors. And the Rockcliffe area in Toronto was ranked the highest, and the TRCA continues to work on risk reduction efforts in these high ranking clusters. And the full assessment can actually be found online, and more details, as we said, on page 48 of the roadmap. Now, in your planning efforts, something to consider is that adapting for a 100-year event may not always be worth the minimized annual damage costs, but that really depends on your specific context and business case. So there are opportunities to save costs in implementation when you're aligning your adaptation efforts with routine operation and maintenance activities. So adaptation is important and effective when you're investing in the right measures. So I'm going to pass it over to Glenn to walk you through a case study.
Great, thanks, Shelley. And so this is just one example as well in the RPWCO roadmap to emphasize before we actually walk through a conceptual example in the city of Windsor. And this is an example that's provided specifically around New York City and some of the work that they've been focusing on around becoming climate resilient, specifically in areas that have historically had more vulnerable populations and a lack of investment in infrastructure systems. So we won't spend too much time on this New York City case study today, but again, to emphasize that these types of case examples are peppered throughout the RPWCO roadmap, and to really dig into some of the lessons learned here as to what they use to prioritize their risks and their communities and how they identify the study area, and in this case in Queens. So strongly encourage you to kind of dig further into these examples, but if you go to the next slide, I'll reintroduce the case study to walk through in relation to the city of Windsor. And so if you have been following along in previous training sessions, which we hope you have been, this will be very familiar to you, but this is a conceptual case study out of the city of Windsor's East Riverside neighborhood. And this was selected in light of the fact that the excellent information that was already available through an East Riverside flood risk assessment. And so what we've done is we've taken that and applied that information as part of the roadmap to identify and kind of explain conceptually how the roadmap process can inform priorities. And so what you're seeing on this slide here is just a reintroduction of the area of the neighborhood, and that's outlined in red there. You can see how there's the west of Little River area and the east of Little River area. But the key question here is, how do we take this map and these series of assets that are identified numerically there and identify spatial priorities for planning, for future investigations? And just by way of reintroduction, the flood risk assessment that was completed looked at several time horizons in terms of instantaneous or flood levels. And so you can see there that they looked at 100-year flood events in 2018, the 100-year event into 2030s, and the 100-year event in 2050s. And so you're going to see some of the results kind of peppered through this conceptual example here to show what you can do once the hazard has been analyzed, once it's been assessed, and once it's been mapped out. And so before we move forward, I'll just briefly walk you through the assets that are in scope of this example here. And you can see there that the number 1 is the Little River Pollution Control Plant. 2 and 3 are 2 different pump stations that are located, one to the left or one to the west of Little River and one to the east. The Lakeview Marina is identified as number 4 on this map, and there are several arterial roads. And it'll be important as to how these come into play to inform relative spatial priorities. So next slide. And so the RPWCO roadmap process and activities that are part of that really kind of give you an example of how you can begin looking at asset vulnerabilities. And so this is a very, very simplified example as to what you could consider 1 or 2 factors for each of these different assets to inform their level of vulnerability. So if one were to envision an accelerated pathway of analysis, no detailed modeling, no quantitative exercises in great depth, but the idea is that you'd want to still have an understanding of these the vulnerabilities of each of these assets. So activity 11 actually enables you to do that in a workshop or an engagement type session with the folks who understand these assets best. And so you'll see here a graph that is currently blank, but it has 2 axes. On the y-axis, it has the number of people dependent on the asset, ranging from no people to the most people. And on the x-axis, it has the extent to which the asset might be damaged if it's impacted, in this case by flooding, ranging from no damage to being completely destroyed and needing to be rebuilt or reconstructed. And so how you could envision this process happening in a workshop format is to convene a series of stakeholders and staff around the table, perhaps virtually in the world of COVID, but the idea would be to discuss 1 asset at a time and to consider, let's say for the pollution control plant, how many, or relatively speaking to the other assets, how many people are dependent on this asset? And if it were to be flooded, relatively speaking, how much damage might it actually obtain? And so I think it's quite clear that the pollution control plant in this example would have the most number of people dependent on it compared to, let's say, the marina, the arterial roads, and perhaps the pump stations as well. And so the idea would be to walk through these logically, and one could also envision doing this for other factors. But for this example today, we're going to focus in specifically on these X and Y axes. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see one example output of this activity. And so this is the result actually after having this conversation with the RPWCO climate change subcommittee members. And so you can see, perhaps unsurprisingly, the pollution control plant did end up on the highest y-axis, having the most number of people dependent on its service that it's providing, followed by pump stations, then the arterial roads, and the marina with the least number of people dependent on it. But the pump stations were identified to receiving or potentially being more damaged in the event of a flood compared to the arterial roads, for instance. And I think it's important to mention as part of these activities and these discussions to document your assumptions or any sort of key nuggets that come out in that conversation. So for instance, if someone is suggesting that the arterial roads are not considered evacuation routes, and therefore they've identified them to have less people dependent on it, that's important to document. So as you go through these conversations, consider those types of commentary. And the other thing to consider is how do we kind of take this conceptual relative prioritization of vulnerability and move it into a numerical exercise. And so consider the scale of both of these axes. And one question that will commonly come up in examples of risk analysis and in vulnerability assessment is weighting. And do you weight factors twice as much? Do you weight social factors or people as more than structural factors? And this really is dependent on your jurisdiction and the folks in your jurisdiction. So there is no one size fits all. We have seen both non-weighted approaches and weighted approaches as part of these types of analyses. And so for the purposes of this example, we had a bit of a conversation as part of developing the roadmap, and this is conceptually going to weight the social factor twice as high as the structural factor. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that by doing so, you can assign numerical values. So in that assumption that the people are twice as important as the structural aspect of these assets, we can say that the y-axis now ranges from 0 through 10, and the x ranges from 0 through 5, or half as much as the y. And so by doing so, we can ultimately evaluate or assign a numerical value to each of these assets. And so you can see here that the pollution control plant has a vulnerability score of 16, or the highest vulnerability here based on this quick and dirty analysis, followed by the pump station of 15, then the marina, and then the arterial roads. But again, this is just the vulnerability component and not the consequence or actually factoring in whether it's been impacted by the hazard, which will come next. So next slide. And so this is an overlay of the results of that East Riverside flood risk assessment under the current 100-year flood condition. And so you can see here, we've overlaid these assets conceptually and just color-coded them based on whether they'd be flooded or not under current conditions. And so you can see here, if the asset number is colored as blue, then it has been inundated. If it's in red, it has not been inundated. And so this is essentially an exercise to understand whether or not the hazard has been impacting these assets. And so what you can ultimately come up with through a quick analysis like this is whether or not there are consequences to each one of these assets. And so you can see in the table here at the bottom that the pollution control plant still comes out as the most consequential, it being flooded, but the marina, for instance, has not been flooded, and so there's little consequences associated with that. But again, this is under current conditions. And so what we can then do is consider the future 100-year event and how that might change things. And so you can go to the next slide. And this then indicates that more assets are ultimately being flooded. So you can now see that the pumping stations, identified as number 2 on this map, are both now inundated with floodwaters in the 2050s condition. And so again, it pops up that score associated with the consequence, but it doesn't necessarily change the vulnerability that was initially assigned to it. And so just pausing here and thinking about it from a conceptual standpoint, this is interesting, but we need to be able to move to prioritizing based on geographic areas. And so what you'll see on the next slide is an approach used to do that, and to really start to think about how do I take a map or outputs like this and inform my master planning processes, or an equity-based approach to assign priorities. And so this is an example of the current priorities based on an approach of taking a 1 kilometer squared grid cell across the East Riverside neighborhood. And so each one of these squares on this map now are 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. You could use a different spatial scale of analysis, and that is absolutely at the discretion of the jurisdiction and how big your geography is. But in the context of this neighborhood, we are quite zoomed in here on this area of Windsor. And so we're looking at the number of assets located in each one of these grid cells or in each one of these areas. And you can see here how the area around the pollution control plant and having more arterial roads has kind of elevated that to one of the highest risks, followed by the area with the pump station above it, and then some of the areas in yellow as being kind of moderate, and the rest being more 0 scores, so not assuming that they're going to be at risk under the current conditions. But again, we can now re-examine this under future conditions in the next slide. And so this is how kind of future flood conditions might pop up or elevate priorities in certain areas. So you can see here how the Little River Pollution Control Plant and the area around that is still a priority here based on the consequences of the assets, but now we're also seeing the area with the pump station further to the west also be elevated as a priority in future flood conditions, as well as a few other areas kind of change color. And so the idea here is that you could then go into these areas and describe or discuss what is located there, what's driving vulnerabilities, and can we actually take this output and use it to inform specifically design of projects or investigate further. But again, a conceptual example to look at the relative priorities in a quick manner to enable that next step towards implementation. So next slide. And so that's the kind of the walkthrough of the conceptual case study. But we have two additional slides just to kind of emphasize the importance of looking at data, especially around costs for assets and the resources you could kind of mine as part of these assessments, because it will ultimately come down to what data you have available to you and can you actually access the numbers you might need to inform some of these types of decisions. So next slide. And so just a couple of sources that we wanted to kind of identify for damage costs. And again, this will depend on your jurisdiction and how much the work has been done in relation to these types of works. So consider other municipalities, potentially neighboring municipalities or other jurisdictions that have done some of this work. Consider insurance data as an example for where you might be able to mine damage costs and financial information. Consider also the fact that there are many international sources of information around this out of Europe, out of the United States, and so leverage these where appropriate, or either other jurisdictions in Canada. In our experience, we have seen some of the damage costs adopted and adapted out of Alberta in Ontario's contexts. Again, just being updated for the local knowledge and context piece. And other examples of where you can kind of find this type of data is through historical impacts or events that have been costed out, newspaper articles or media to kind of document what happened and when, and of course, staff, stakeholders, technicians, and those that understand the systems, and whether they might have had to submit a budget request, access reserve funding, make a provincial request for additional funds in the event of a damage. And so there's a lot of different sources to think about here, particularly early on in your risk assessment process. So I think with that, you can go to the next slide, and this is the last slide, and this is just one example of where you can get your damage costs, and this is an example of a 2017 storm. So again, documenting the extent of the damage, how many flood calls that occurred, and then the amount of costs that were ultimately insured losses, and then the city's costs that were uninsurable, for instance. So documenting these historical impacts can help us with moving forward in terms of decisions. Next slide. And I think with that, we are ready to move into question and answer period, and I'll turn on my video here and we can have a bit of a facilitated Q&A.
Hi, Shelley and Glenn. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question about mapping. You described the importance of geospatial data and information as part of the risk assessment process. Can you speak a bit more to the mapping outputs from this process and what these might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess just stepping back, I would suggest that mapping is one of the most critical tools to enable conversations around risk assessment outputs, specifically that can convey a message to senior decision makers, to council, and to communicate the findings of a risk assessment more broadly to public and to other stakeholders. A couple of considerations and how this kind of RPWCO roadmap process kind of equips you to develop these maps is to think about the spatial scale that you might be assessing risk at. And so whether that is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, 5 kilometers at a time, or by that unit of analysis. And it also helps you kind of think about the level of detail that might be needed. So for example, if these maps have confidential information, that's important to kind of acknowledge up front and have that conversation about what's internal versus external as part of sharing or communicating. Other than that, we recommend as a best practice to convey the confidence and the completeness of the data that's being used in the map explicitly in the legend. Oftentimes you'll see map products with some very fascinating results, but it's not clear exactly what data went into it to inform that level of detail. So having a bit of a description or disclaimer there would be helpful. And of course, using the color coding system of red being the highest, green being the lowest to kind of quickly be able to guide the user's eye. But I think the key message associated with mapping is just use that as a critical tool to communicate results and kind of feel free to get creative with some of the outputs and, you know, zooming into certain areas that might be more hotspot areas, for example, to a hazard impact or otherwise. But it does help kind of set the importance of these types of products out of the risk assessment process through the RPWCO guide.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, great question. Next question. Any other questions around this particular training session?
Yes, it's Karina from Windsor. Assessing our hazards and consequences is a critical step in step 4. Where can we find additional support to better understand potential consequences of the various hazards we are facing in our communities?
Yeah, that's a great question, Karina. So there are several sources that are actually explicitly identified in the RPWCO roadmap. So I'll speak to a couple of them, I guess, right now. But again, encourage everyone to kind of go to the actual guide and look at those. But several, I would suggest, literature studies and reviews have already been completed around asset vulnerability. And that is an essential part of the process to know how assets can be affected by hazards. But it's important to note that not all assets will be affected the same for all hazards. And so it is case by case or asset by asset specific in some ways. So for example, if you're dealing with fires or wildfires, it may cause structural damage if it's a smaller wildfire, or it may cause complete loss if it's a bigger wildfire, just as a basic example. Again, likewise, the extent of something being inundated by storm surge may cause losses that are different than pluvial flooding due to water quality concentration differences or how long the water actually is inundating those assets. So in terms of sources and where we can kind of find these additional resources, the guide points to HazUS as a resource in terms of some of its publications, as well as on some of the European publications around depth damage functions and the curves developed out there. In terms of more local or Canadian examples, the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority actually adapted for Ontario data and information out of Alberta's provincial flood damage assessment. And so some of the numbers and the data sources in there have been adapted for a local context in Ontario, as well as places like MPAC or the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation that have data sets in that regard. So kind of thinking outside the box where possible, but there are several, I would suggest, literature, studies, and publications that are mentioned to mine that detail. But that's a great question. Thanks.
Thanks, Glenn.
Hi, Glenn and Shelley. Thank you. This is Manny from Region of Durham. Glenn, you mentioned once you undertake the initial desktop scan about the hazard data as well as the asset vulnerabilities, we need to have a workshop with the stakeholders to validate the information. I'm just wondering if workshop is the format or is the only format, and why it's critical, or there are other methods for engaging the stakeholders in this conversation?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And while a workshop specifically isn't critical, it's really encouraged. It's a great way to bring everyone together, and bringing together that local knowledge and stakeholders. It's really critical to help validate the information that you've been identifying in the literature review or as you're reading through the resources that Glenn just pointed out. And it gives you a chance to discuss with your experts and your stakeholders if this information is actually relevant to your local context. But we know that depending on your resources and everything that's going on and COVID, that sometimes a full day workshop, it just might not be feasible for you. So in that case, we encourage you to at least reach out to your relevant stakeholders. And there's other methods, even if it's a phone call, if it's an email, if it's an online survey to discuss your findings or ask them to weigh in on some of this critical information and just to validate, and point out if there's any red flags. So getting the stakeholders in the community involved is a really critical step. So it might not be in that workshop format, as we said, but reaching out in some capacity, it really is sort of required to make sure that you're on the right path. And step one of the roadmap, it'll provide you more guidance on identifying those key participants and stakeholders and that need to be sort of a part of this validation process. But you can be creative with how you want to actually reach out to them and receive feedback. And I think everyone's getting very used to this virtual world now. So, you can probably use, like I said, email, telephone calls, online surveys to gain that feedback.
Thank you.
Thanks, Manny.
Hi, it's Jake Porter from Thunder Bay. Step 4 provided some guidance on prioritization, and I was wondering if you could share any additional considerations or tools that could help us prioritize areas or projects once we've identified a list of hazards and potential impacts.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Jacob. So in particular, Activity 13 in Appendix 1 is a really great place to start, and it's a great tool to help you prioritize the climate hazards that are based on your estimated risk. But there are other considerations, I should say, for prioritization that might help you in that process. And one quite easy one is readiness level. How ready are you to actually implement any of those actions and strategies? Ones that could be implemented sooner, they might actually be prioritized over actions that could require additional information or resources that you might not have on hand right now. And other tools that might be able to assist you in prioritization could include things even like expert judgment or focus group. You might look towards your multi-criteria analysis, decision trees, or influence diagrams. And all of these additional tools are laid out in the actual roadmap. So we encourage you to go through and see which one sort of best fits with your municipality. So the roadmap does provide a lot of additional information to help your municipality with prioritization. And that doesn't matter if you're taking the rapid assessment or the deeper dive. It provides resources that's going to help you out through this whole process. So, thanks, Jacob.
Thank you.
Great, thanks everyone. Well, I think this wraps up our Step 4 training session. We have one remaining training session that will be about Steps 5 and 6. So thanks very much for attending today.